Family. It's the foundation we grow from, the people who shape us, and the ties that hold us when the world feels uncertain. For many, family is sacred, a bond that no one should ever try to sever. And yet, for me, the greatest betrayal I ever experienced didn't come from a stranger on the street or a rival at work. It came from inside my own home, from the woman I once believed was my life partner. She wasn't just competing for my attention. She was plotting against the very woman who gave me life. My mother. When people talk about tension between a wife and a mother-in-law, it's often painted as something normal, even comical. We hear jokes about meddling mothers, possessive sons, and jealous wives. But in truth, those tensions can run deep and sometimes they turn toxic. In my case, what began as little hints of discomfort spiraled into a calculated effort to destroy the bond between me and my mother. This wasn't just friction. This was manipulation. This was betrayal wrapped in a smile. At first, I didn't see it. Looking back now, I wonder how I could have been so blind. My wife appeared perfect, attentive, supportive, caring toward me, and, on the surface, even respectful toward my mother. She played her role convincingly. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I was blessed to have a wife who embraced my family. But under that polished surface, something darker was brewing. She resented my mother's presence in our lives, resented the influence she thought my mother had over me, and slowly, she began laying the groundwork to poison that relationship. In the early days, it started small. My wife would point out little things. Comments my mother had supposedly made, looks she claimed to have noticed, intentions she swore were harmful. "Your mom doesn't really respect you," she whispered. "She only pretends to care, but deep down, she thinks she knows better than both of us." At the time, I brushed these remarks off. I loved my mother. I had no reason to doubt her love for me. But when such words come from the person you share your bed with, the person you trust most, they plant seeds. Even if you don't believe them at first, they linger in your mind. And those seeds began to grow. I noticed myself second-guessing my mother's words, reinterpreting her actions through the lens my wife provided. When my mother offered advice, I wondered, was she trying to help, or was she undermining us? When she expressed concern, I questioned, was it love or was it control? It was as though my wife had given me a new pair of glasses, distorted lenses that made me see suspicion where there had once been only love. Some might ask, how could you fall for that? Didn't you know your mother better? And the answer is yes, I thought I did. But here's the thing about manipulation. It doesn't usually shout, it whispers. It doesn't break the truth apart all at once. It chips away at it, piece by piece, until you're left questioning your own memories. And by the time you notice something is wrong, the damage is already spreading. In many families, the spouse becomes the closest confidant. They see your vulnerabilities, your doubts, your insecurities. My wife used that closeness to shape my thoughts without me even realizing it. When I was stressed, she framed my mother as the cause. When I was happy, she hinted that my mother secretly resented it. She wove her story carefully, wrapping it in what seemed like love for me. She said she only wanted to protect me. She said she hated seeing me hurt. And I believed her. Here's the painful truth. I didn't just fail to defend my mother. I started to withdraw from her. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. My mother noticed the distance, of course, but she didn't confront me. She just carried it silently, with the quiet heartbreak only a parent can feel when they sense their child pulling away. Looking back now, I see how cruelly effective my wife's plan was. She didn't need to attack my mother directly, not at first. All she had to do was make me doubt. Doubt turned into distance, and distance created the crack she wanted. By the time I realized what was happening, the bond I'd always thought unbreakable had already begun to fracture. This is a part of the story that hurts the most. I love them both. I thought I was keeping peace by listening to my wife, by trying to balance loyalties. But what I was really doing was allowing lies to grow unchecked. I was handing over the power to define my relationship with my mother to someone who secretly wanted to destroy it. Why tell this story now? Because too many people underestimate the quiet power of manipulation in families. We think we'd notice. We think we'd stop it. But the truth is, Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. And sometimes we don't discover their true intentions until it's far too late. As I share this, I want you to ask yourself, if someone close to you began whispering doubts about another person you love, would you recognize it? Would you stand firm? Or would you, like me, only see the full picture after the damage was done? This is not just my story. It's a warning. Betrayal rarely comes dressed as the enemy. More often, it comes disguised as love, concern, and loyalty. It comes from the person you'd least suspect. And in my case, it came from the woman I had vowed to love and trust for the rest of my life. What follows in this journey is not easy to hear. The pain, the realization, the heartbreak, it changed me forever. But it's a story worth telling, because silence allows manipulation to win. And I refuse to let that be the end of my mother's dignity or my own growth. So here we begin. The unraveling of a marriage, the slow poisoning of a sacred bond, and the truth I discovered far too late. In the early years of our marriage, everything seemed almost idyllic. I told myself I had built a life that most men only dream about, a wife who adored me, a mother who always stood by me, and a home that felt secure. If there were cracks forming beneath the surface, I didn't see them. I chose not to see them. The truth is, when you're in love, you often overlook things that should make you pause. You excuse little comments. You rationalize subtle hostility, and you convince yourself that harmony exists even when it doesn't. My wife was clever, and her cleverness wasn't the kind that showed up in her career or public life. It was in her ability to read people, to sense their weaknesses, and to exploit them. She learned quickly that my greatest vulnerability was my deep love and loyalty to both her and my mother, and she decided that loyalty couldn't be shared. She wanted it all, exclusively. And she began working toward that outcome with a quiet determination I only came to understand later. At family dinners, she would sit across the table from my mother, smiling politely, nodding at every word. To any outsider, it looked like respect. But beneath the table, she pressed her nails into my hand when my mother spoke too long. Later that night, she whispered in my ear, "Did you notice how she dismissed your opinion? She always has to act like she knows better." It was never an open fight. It was a whisper campaign, an erosion of trust that only I was meant to hear. I remember one particular evening when my mother came to visit. She had cooked one of my favorite meals, a tradition she had kept since I was a boy. My wife praised her cooking with a smile, but when the door closed behind my mother later that night, her expression hardened. "She's trying to make you dependent on her," she said. "You're a grown man with a wife now. Don't you see how she's trying to keep control?" I laughed it off at the time, but the seed had been planted. The next time my mother cooked for me, I couldn't enjoy it without wondering if my wife was right. I didn't realize it then, but my enjoyment of those meals, those small pieces of my childhood and comfort, was being replaced with guilt. I felt caught between two women I loved, unsure of whose version of the truth I should believe. What makes manipulation so devastating is that it preys on love. My wife didn't need to yell, didn't need to forbid me from seeing my mother. Instead, she framed everything as concern for me. She said she worried my mother's influence was holding me back, that I needed to step into independence. She wrapped every jab at my mother in the language of protection and love. And I believed her, because who questions protection when it comes from the person who shares your bed? Over time, the distance grew. My phone calls to my mother became shorter, more perfunctory. I avoided her invitations, telling myself I was too busy, when in reality, I didn't want to deal with the arguments that followed at home whenever I spent too much time with her. My wife never forbade it, but her disapproving silence was louder than any words. The message was clear. My closeness to my mother was a betrayal to her, and so I withdrew. What I didn't realize then was the toll this was taking on my mother. She was a proud woman, someone who had weathered life's storms with dignity. She didn't confront me directly. Instead, she accepted my excuses, smiled when I said I couldn't visit, and told me she understood. But I see now that she was hurting. She was losing her son, not to death or distance, but to the quiet, corrosive influence of someone I had chosen over her. The hardest part recounting this story is admitting how willingly I participated in my mother's isolation. I wasn't forced. I wasn't tricked in the traditional sense. I simply chose the path of least resistance. It was easier to nod along with my wife than to challenge her. It was easier to convince myself that my mother would always understand, always forgive. But mothers are not infinite wells of patience. They feel the sting of rejection just like anyone else. The cracks in my marriage and in my family bond didn't appear overnight, but by this point, they were widening. I was drifting further from my mother, while becoming more entangled in the narrative my wife spun around me. She had created a world where she was my only true ally, the only one who had my best interests at heart, and I was falling for it. Looking back now, I realized that this was a turning point. This was when I could have stopped it, when I could have questioned the whispers, re examined the evidence, and reconnected with the woman who had raised me. But I didn't. I chose silence. I chose blindness. And by the time I opened my eyes, the damage had already taken root. This is the cruel irony of betrayal. It doesn't always come crashing into your life with fireworks and thunder. Sometimes it seeps in slowly, disguised as love, until you can no longer tell the difference between concern and control, between protection and possession. And by the time you realize the truth, it has already stolen something precious from you. That was my reality. And it was only the beginning. The shift from subtle doubt to open division came faster than I realized. At first, my wife relied on whispers, private conversations, and careful nudges to shape the way I saw my mother. But once she sensed that I had started to pull away, her strategy grew bolder. It was no longer just about planting seeds of doubt. It became about rewriting history, altering events, and twisting words until the truth itself was unrecognizable. I remember one afternoon vividly. My mother had stopped by to bring a basket of fresh fruit from the market. It was a small gesture, the kind she had made countless times when I was growing up. She placed the basket on the counter, kissed my cheek, and said, "Take care of yourself." To me, it was nothing more than a mother's kindness. But later that evening, my wife turned it into something sinister. "Do you see what she's doing?" she asked. "She's trying to remind you that you can't take care of yourself, that you'll always need her." Her voice dripped with conviction, as if she had uncovered some hidden motive. And I, foolishly, weakly, entertained the thought. Was it possible? Had my mother's love always been laced with control? That question began to echo in my head, eroding the certainty I once held about her intentions. It didn't stop there. My wife started recounting conversations that I hadn't even witnessed. She'd say things like, "Your mother told me you'll never amount to anything without her guidance," or "She said I'm not good enough for you." At first, I was shocked, even defensive. My mother would never say that. I protested, but my wife was prepared. She played hurt, tears welling in her eyes as she whispered, "Why would I make something like that up? I thought you trusted me." That was a trap. If I doubted her, it meant I was betraying her. If I trusted her, it meant doubting my mother. And more often than not, I chose to keep peace in my marriage by believing my wife. Soon, I found myself confronting my mother over things she had never actually said. I asked her why she would question my independence, why she couldn't accept my wife. My mother's confusion was genuine, her hurt plain in her eyes. "I never said that," she insisted, her voice trembling. But I didn't listen, not really. My wife had already convinced me that my mother was manipulative, that she was skilled at playing the victim. So I stood there, blind to the truth, accusing the one person who had always been on my side. It's hard to describe the shame I feel now when I think back to those moments. I watched my mother's eyes fill with tears. I heard the crack in her voice, and still, I chose to believe the lies whispered in my ear. Betrayal isn't always about what someone else does to you. Sometimes, it's about what you allow to happen because you're too afraid to face conflict, too desperate to preserve a fragile peace. The tension escalated further when my wife began isolating me from family gatherings. "Your mother doesn't want me there," she would claim. "She makes me feel unwelcome. Why should we go somewhere I'm not respected?" At first, I pushed back, insisting that she come with me. But the arguments that followed were exhausting. She would cry, accuse me of choosing my mother over her, and retreat into silence until I gave in. Eventually, I stopped going altogether. It was easier to stay home than to face the storm. And that's how manipulation wins, not by force, but by exhaustion. It wears you down until surrender feels like relief. By this point, my mother must have known something was terribly wrong. The warmth between us had cooled into formality. Phone calls were polite, but distant. I rarely visited, and when I did, I was distracted, quick to leave. She never accused me, never demanded an explanation. She simply accepted what I gave her, no matter how little. But I could see the sadness in her eyes, the unspoken question: what did I do to lose you? The truth is, she hadn't done anything, but I had. I allowed someone else's insecurities to dictate my loyalty. I allowed myself to be turned against a woman who had sacrificed everything for me. And every time I looked away from that reality, every time I chose silence over confrontation, the wedge between us grew deeper. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if there was a single moment when I could have broken the cycle, when I could have seen through the lies. Maybe it was that day with the fruit basket. Maybe it was the first time my wife told me something outrageous that my mother supposedly said. Or maybe it was the look in my mother's eyes when I questioned her love. There were opportunities, but I didn't take them. I was too entangled in the illusion of marital harmony to face the uncomfortable truth. This is how betrayal works. It doesn't just break the bond between you and the victim. It reshapes you. It turns you into someone you don't recognize, suspicious, defensive, distant. I wasn't just losing my mother. I was losing myself. And yet, as painful as this part of the story is, it was still only the build-up. I hadn't yet seen the full scope of my wife's intentions. The lies, the manipulations, they weren't random. They were part of a larger plan, one that would eventually explode into the open. But by the time I understood, the damage was already devastating. But here's where the story twists into something most people wouldn't believe unless they had witnessed it. While the billionaire's inner circle debated lawsuits, reputation damage, and the cost of scrapping the aircraft, someone utterly unexpected wandered into the scene. He wasn't part of the aviation industry. He wasn't an employee of the company. He wasn't even dressed like someone who belonged inside a luxury hangar where billion-dollar jets slept. He was homeless. His clothes were layered, worn thin by nights spent under bridges and days of wandering sidewalks. His beard was overgrown, his hands rough from years of labor that no one seemed to value anymore. To the casual observer, he was just another man who had been forgotten by society, carrying nothing but a weathered backpack and a quiet, weary dignity. At first, his presence drew stares, confused ones, irritated ones, and even hostile ones. Security moved closer, unsure why he was there. Engineers whispered among themselves. What business did someone like him have near a plane that had consumed millions in expert hours and still sat broken? He didn't have a badge. He didn't have credentials. He didn't even seem to notice the glares. But then, he did something that shifted the entire room. He walked closer to the engine, with a kind of familiarity in his eyes that none of the experts could deny. He didn't gawk at the jet like most would. He didn't marvel at its luxury. Instead, he studied it, piece by piece, the way someone studies an old friend they haven't seen in years. He touched the edge of the engine, cowling gently, almost reverently, as if remembering something that lived in his bones. Whispers grew louder. Some scoffed. What does he think he's doing? One engineer muttered under his breath. Another smirked, certain that this was just some wandering soul chasing a warm place to stand. But a few noticed something different. His gaze wasn't vacant. It was sharp, precise, and purposeful, scanning details that had escaped the experts for weeks. The billionaire, restless and desperate, almost dismissed him. But there was a strange air about this man, something quietly commanding, something that made even the skeptical pause for just a moment. And in that moment, a fragile window of possibility opened. Because sometimes, brilliance doesn't arrive in a polished suit or a glossy resume. Sometimes it walks in wearing torn shoes, carrying stories the world has forgotten, but holding knowledge no amount of money can buy. And in that hangar, with millions wasted and pride shattered, a man society had overlooked entirely was about to reveal a truth that would shake everyone in the room. The silence in the hangar grew heavier as the homeless man lingered near the massive jet. For a long moment, nobody moved. Engineers shifted uneasily, Security glanced toward the billionaire for direction, and the billionaire himself wrestled with his pride. Letting the stranger get any closer to the jet would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. And yet, what was normal anymore? Millions had been spent, every expert had failed, and time was running out. The man finally spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of someone who had lived too many years without being heard. "I know what's wrong with it," he said. At first, the room erupted in a wave of disbelief. Some laughed under their breath. Others shook their heads. One of the lead engineers snapped. "Do you even understand what you're looking at? This is a Rolls-Royce Trent engine, one of the most advanced pieces of engineering on the planet. You think you can solve what entire teams of us couldn't." The man didn't flinch. He looked at the engine again, his eyes narrowing on a small section near the compressor blades, a part so minute that most people wouldn't notice unless they had spent years inside the guts of machines. "You're looking in the wrong place," he replied calmly. "The problem isn't where you think it is. It's a misalignment in the secondary flow. You've been chasing the wrong failure." The word stunned them. He spoke with precision, with fluency, not like a guess, not like someone bluffing for attention, but like a man who had once lived and breathed this world. The billionaire raised a hand to silence the protests. His voice, sharp but curious, cut through the tension. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, as if the question stirred memories he had buried long ago. Finally, he answered, "I used to be an engineer. Before I lost everything." His eyes flickered with something raw, pain, regret, and maybe even shame. "I spent years designing systems like this. I know what I'm looking at." The revelation shifted the energy in the room. Skepticism still hung thick in the air, but doubt was no longer unanimous. Some engineers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the man's observation wasn't random. It was technical, specific, and disturbingly plausible. The billionaire, desperate enough to gamble, gestured toward the man. "Fine. Show me." Security hesitated, but the billionaire's authority was absolute. They stepped back, allowing the homeless man a clear path to the engine. He set his backpack down, rolled up his sleeves, and approached the machine with a reverence no one else had shown. Where others had treated the jet like a puzzle to be solved for money or prestige, he touched it like something sacred, like he understood both its fragility and its power. Slowly, he began pointing out details. The wear pattern on a bolt, the faint discoloration in the metal housing, the almost imperceptible vibration line. "This isn't about the part itself," he explained. "It's about the sequence. One flaw cascaded into another, and now you're fixing symptoms instead of the cause. You'll never get it right that way." Every word he spoke began to dismantle the arrogance in the room. Engineers who had dismissed him seconds earlier now leaned in, listening, their pride battling with the gnawing truth that he might be right. And then came the moment that silenced them all. With nothing more than a simple adjustment, something so small it almost looked laughable, he demonstrated a correction. It wasn't a full repair yet, but it was enough. Enough to make the engine respond differently. Enough to prove that his insight wasn't just theory but real, working knowledge. The hangar fell into stunned silence. The same men and women who had dismissed him were now staring at the machine, then at him, struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed. And in that silence, a quiet, undeniable truth echoed louder than any applause. Brilliance can wear any face, even when the world has chosen not to see. The silence after the homeless man's demonstration was thick enough to suffocate. For the first time in days, the jet didn't groan, didn't resist. It responded. It wasn't fixed yet, but it was different. It was alive. The billionaire leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing, studying the machine and then the man with equal intensity. He had spent fortunes chasing solutions, had hired the brightest minds, and yet this ragged figure with dirt-streaked hands had done in minutes what no one else had. Pride clawed at him, demanding he dismiss it as luck, a fluke. But the evidence stood humming before him. The chief engineer finally broke the silence. His voice cracked with something between disbelief and reluctant respect. "He's right. That adjustment shouldn't have worked, but it did." He found the actual fault. Murmurs spread through the team, engineers whispering, double-checking, replaying every step in their heads. Some were angry at being outsmarted. Others were awed. A few were simply humbled. But all of them knew what this meant. This homeless man wasn't just guessing. He was seeing something they had all missed. The billionaire straightened. His voice was commanding, but a tremor of something rare, uncertainty, ran beneath it. "Finish it," he said. The man blinked, as though the words took a moment to sink in. He hadn't been given permission to lead anything in years. Slowly, he nodded, then turned back to the engine. He asked for tools, not the expensive, over-engineered instruments the staff had been using, but simple ones. A torque wrench, a flashlight, a rag. The billionaire raised an eyebrow, but nodded for crew to comply. When the tools arrived, the man's hands moved with practiced precision. Not the fumbling of a pretender, but the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Step by step, he guided the process. He adjusted tolerances, realigned parts, recalibrated sensors. His explanations were steady, almost gentle, as though he were teaching rather than fixing. You don't fight the system. You listen to it. Every engine tells a story if you care enough to hear it. Those words hit harder than any technical instruction. The engineers realized they had been approaching the jet with arrogance, treating it like an adversary to be conquered. He, on the other hand, treated it like a partner, like something worthy of patience and respect. Hours passed, but the energy in the hangar never faltered. Slowly, the jet's engine began to respond, the snarls fading into a low, powerful hum. Lights on the control panels flickered from red to green. The impossibility that had mocked them for weeks was unraveling under the hands of a man the world had discarded. Finally, the moment came. He stepped back, wiping his hand on the rag. Exhaustion etched into his face, but resolve burning in his eyes. "Start her up," he said. The billionaire gestured sharply. An engineer moved the control console, hands trembling as they engaged the sequence. The massive jet trembled, coughed, then roared to life. But this time, the sound was purer, strong, stable. The hangar shook with the vibration of success. Monitors flashed green across the board. The impossible had become real. The machine that had devoured millions in failed repairs was now running perfectly, brought back to life by a man who slept on concrete. For a moment, no one moved. The power of what they were witnessing was too great. Then, slowly, applause began, hesitant at first, then building. Engineers who had mocked him hours earlier now clapped with genuine awe. The billionaire's expression was unreadable, torn between humiliation and gratitude, but even he couldn't deny the truth. The man had done the impossible. The billionaire finally stepped forward, his voice low, almost grudging. "You saved me, you saved this." The homeless man met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't do it for you," he said quietly. "I did it because the work deserved it, because the truth deserved to be seen." That line struck like a lightning bolt. It wasn't about money, fame, or recognition. It was about integrity, about doing what was right when everyone else had given up. The applause grew louder, echoing to the cavernous space. Yet amid the celebration, the man quietly gathered his tools, as if none of it mattered. He had done what needed to be done. That was enough. But for the billionaire, for everyone in that room, it was not enough. This man had just rewritten what they thought they knew about genius, about value, about who mattered in the world, and whether he wanted it or not, they would never see him the same way again. The roar of the engine still reverberated to the hangar, but inside, a deeper silence had taken hold. Not the silence of disbelief this time, but of recognition. Every pair of eyes was locked on the man who had walked in as a stranger, dismissed as worthless, and emerged as the only one who could tame the beast of steel before them. The billionaire stood rigid, jaw clenched, as though a war raged inside him. For decades, his empire had been built on control, on the certainty that wealth could buy brilliance, loyalty, respect. But now, standing in front of him was living proof that the world didn't bow to money alone. A man with nothing had accomplished what money could not. Finally, the billionaire broke the silence. His voice, stripped of its usual arrogance, carried something rare, humility. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, his eyes dropping to the oil-stained rag still in his hand. It doesn't matter, he said softly. But the billionaire pressed, his tone almost desperate now. It does. You've done something no one else could. You've given me back what I thought was lost forever. The least I can do is know who you are. Slowly, the man lifted his gaze. His voice was steady, but heavy with the weight of years. My name is Samuel. I used to build engines like this before life decided I didn't belong anymore. A ripple of shock moved through the engineers. Some recognized the name. Samuel Harris, once a respected systems designer, quietly erased from the industry after a series of personal losses had sent him spiraling into poverty. A man forgotten by colleagues, swallowed by the unforgiving machinery of the world. The billionaire took a step closer. Samuel, you saved me today. Let me help you now. I can give you a home, a place on my team, money, respect, whatever you want. Samuel's eyes flickered with something unnameable, pain, longing, temptation. For a brief moment, he imagined it. Clean clothes, a bed, the dignity of being one again. But then he shook his head slowly. You don't understand, he said. What I needed, money couldn't buy. What I lost, you can't return. I didn't fix this engine for a paycheck or to stand in your shadow. I fixed it because it deserved to live again. That's enough for me. The words struck harder than any rejection. The billionaire, a man used to buying loyalty with the flick of a pen, now faced the rarest kind of defiance, not of anger, but of principle. Samuel gathered his worn backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and began to walk toward the hangar doors. Every eye followed him, every step echoing with a dignity wealth could never grant. Engineers parted instinctively, not out of pity, but respect. At the threshold, he paused, turning back only once. His voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the room. Don't forget this. Genius isn't about who has the most money or the biggest title. Sometimes, it's just about listening. Listening to the truth, even when it comes from a place you'd rather not look. And with that, he walked out into the night. The billionaire remained still, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Around him, the applause faded into a thoughtful silence. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of power in the room. He was simply a man humbled by a greater truth. Days later, the story spread. Engineers whispered it in labs. Mechanics told it in workshops. And soon, it traveled far beyond the hangar. People spoke of Samuel, the homeless man who had fixed a billionaire's jet when no one else could. A story of redemption, of forgotten brilliance, of dignity refusing to die. Some called it a miracle. Others called it luck. But those who had seen it with their own eyes knew the truth. It was genius born of resilience, a mind sharpened not by privilege but by survival. As for the billionaire, his empire continued, but something inside him had shifted. He could no longer look at the world the same way. He had been reminded, in the most humbling of ways, that greatness isn't owned. It isn't bought. It can appear in the unlikeliest of places, wrapped in rags, walking alone into the night. And somewhere out there, Samuel kept walking, not seeking recognition, not seeking revenge, but carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who had proven, once and for all, that even when the world forgets you, your worth never truly disappears. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones written in contracts or carved into monuments. They're the ones that leave behind a story powerful enough to outlive us all.